In this video, I want to explore liberation theology, just explore some of the key characters in the establishment of it, and look at some critique of it, and look at how it might be relevant to us in understanding the church today, how we approach things, and how we engage in some modern political movements. Let's have a look at some questions which, two things. One is questions which this video will be exploring, but also ones which it's worth holding in mind as you engage with it. One of them is very a broad one, very fundamental, existential question for the church. What is the purpose of the church? Capital T, capital C, the church, and probably also what is the purpose of the church as in the local community, very often centred on a building. Another one which is really the heart of the whole liberation theology discussion, and that is how and where do Christians do their theology? What are the starting points for theology and practice in the church? Now, another set of questions which run alongside this are about poverty. Why is it that people are poor? It's a very complicated question, and it's also one which requires careful analysis, and it has different answers in different countries. So fundamental layer of these questions revolves around: are poor people poor because of their sin, or are they poor because of structural inequalities built into the system of economics and politics within that country? Now, the answers to those questions are going to become quite different if you're exploring that question in a country like UK, where you've got lots and lots of what would we call it, a social safety net, and lots of social support. So you've got free education, you've got free point of use healthcare, there's benefit systems which give money, food and whatever to those who for whatever reason haven't got any other means of getting it. So questions around poverty, why are people poor, in the UK are going to throw up completely different answers to asking questions about why are people poor in less economically developed countries, looking at countries of Africa, as to why people are poor there, and potentially a different set again when you're asking that question in South America. And of course, South America is very much the context for the starting point really of liberation theology. Let's get into what I see as very much the heart of the liberation theology model, and probably the one that's got most to teach us, not just simply as an academic exercise looking at liberation theology, but one which is to be absorbed into church practice. And that is the question: how do we do theology? With a slightly more focus really here on how do we learn our theology. So part of this is the question of where are we when we are learning our theology, when we're having our primary theological shaping, and then where potentially physically, where are we and what methods are we using to continue our theological reflection as Christians. A particular focus here, I suppose, on those in some sort of leadership shaping roles within the church. Let's start then with what I'm calling the traditional model. So a traditional model is one where theology is learned in essentially a college setting. It might be called a seminary, but it's a college setting, usually with a denominational label on it. So my direct experience of this is, I'm Church of England, so the direct experience of this is Church of England, and my own ordination training took place in that traditional model. I was 2 years full time at an Anglican theological college, but also I dipped into Methodist theological training. Not in that I attended it. I used to play football for a Methodist theological college when I was at university, and so I was aware of, again, what that model was like, and it was essentially the same as the Anglican model that I experienced a decade or so later. So the essence of this model is you're there in that traditional academic setting. And the academic setting is, how do you learn your theology? Well, it's this combination of its lectures, it's reading, and so you've got that the image there of the chap sitting in the library. You've got the lectures, you've got the seminars, you've got the essay writing. That's how you're doing your theology. And because it's a denominational, it's a church-based training, that academic study of theology is also located within a sort of church model. So your day is going to be shaped by services, and it will also almost certainly include some sort of practical outworking in terms of you will go and take services in local churches. You might end up with some sort of placements in a church. The essence of this one is that it is going from theory to practice. That's the emphasis on this traditional model. You start with the theory, you're reading your biblical studies, your church history, your theology, your doctrine, your pastoral theology. You're learning all this in an academic setting, and then you go from theory into practice. And so then when you leave the theological college, you then become ordained, you then move into a church setting, and there's an expectation there, and any clergy who have got anything about them will continue their study, and that study then again could be still within that very much traditional model, where you will maybe maintain links with a theological college, and you'll go and sit in the library there periodically, or you're reading your own books, you have your own library that you've built up. But the essence of that, what I'm calling the traditional model, is one which starts with theory, so that is the dominant idea, and then your theory goes into your practice. Now, when we look at liberation theology, it's a model which essentially turns that traditional model on its head, because what this model does is it says the starting point for doing any theology is being rooted in your context, and liberation theology is essentially about the poor, so that's I'll stay with that, but it's a model which could be extended further. And so how does liberation theology do its theology? The starting point is you embed yourself in those poor communities. You are living alongside those poor communities. So you're not sort of learning about the poor by reading a working party report. There was a very famous, very good working party from the Church of England called Faith in the City in the, I think it was probably the 80s, thinking about that now. So you're not learning about the poor by sitting there reading your Faith in the City. You're learning about your poor because you're actually living and working in high-rise estates in some big city, I don't know, Birmingham, I'm thinking UK Birmingham there, or you are, and liberation theology was developed very much in a South American context, and so what you've got there is you've got these Christians, some of them priests, some of them laity, and they're living with the poorest sections of the urban poor in a South American city, which actually makes you Birmingham poor look fairly affluent. So there they are in that context. And it's in that context, there they are with the poor, they live with them, they worship with them, they pray with them, they stand alongside them, they suffer with them, they see firsthand what it's like to be poor. So that's the starting point. You're just living as one of them. Now what that means is then that as you read the Bible, you read the Bible then through the eyes of the poor, and so with that context, you've got that you're existentially embedded with the poor. You're not distant from them, and as you read the Bible alongside the poor, the primary idea behind liberation theology is the way the Bible speaks to you. If you're reading it in a theological college, or you're reading it in some South American urban slum with the poorest of the poor, the Bible is going to speak to you. God is going to speak to you quite differently in those two contexts. And so as as you then do your thinking, what do you do? Are you doing politics or are you doing theology? And this is where liberation theology will tend to merge the two. And you read the Bible, you have no option but see that there's quite a lot, depending on the context, depends on how much, but there's quite a lot of the poverty and injustice and suffering that you are living with in those poor communities, which is caused very directly by unequal power structures, by those very often wealthy elites who are deliberately structuring things so the poor are poor and the poor will suffer. And so you're experiencing firsthand an oppression by the rich and the powerful. And as you live and work alongside them and read the Bible in that context, then that gives you a completely different perspective, a completely different reading of the Bible, different passages, different books in the Bible will speak to you in different ways than following that traditional model. And so as the traditional model went from theory to practice, it's theory that's big and then practice is small, and practice is to a large extent very church-based. Liberation theology, and we use the word praxis here, a good Marxist term, and this is one of the issues we're going to be teasing out. There's a lot of Marxism wrapped up in liberation theology and looking at whether that's inherent or whether they can be separated. But I'll use that term there, praxis. So that is you're just embedded in the reality of life, and you go from your praxis into the theory. The theorizing comes second. It's existential engagement first, and then your reflection and theory will follow on from that. This leads us then to the question, where does the church stand? In other words, is the church primarily aligned with governments, powerful rich elites, big business interests, or is the church aligned and seen to be aligned with the poor, the oppressed, the persecuted, and the exploited? So looking at this, particularly in the South American context, is the church seen as the organisation that it comfortably sits with those rich elites, and it'll provide for them the church ceremonies that they want, the funerals, the weddings, the baptisms, and it's there clearly seen as alongside them in their pockets, because to a certain extent it is those powerful rich elites who have got the money to be able to provide for the church with all that it wants. Let's look briefly then at the Bible in liberation theology, look at a few passages and look at how context can shape perspective. And again, I've got here the two images I'm working with here are showing those two polar opposites, the doing theology in the academic setting. So there we've got the image of those men. They're sitting around. They've got their theology books. They'll be, the setting there is fairly middle class. They've got all the resources they need. They're in an established church context. Let's just assume that they're all ordained, working in churches in a comfortable Western context. And as they read the Bible, what are they getting out of it, and how is it speaking to them? In contrast to the other image, which I'm using as the symbol of liberation theology, where they are their laity, they are reading the Bible and letting it speak to them in the context in which they find themselves, and that's looking at that in terms of a church, just the gathered poor people living in an area where they're suffering oppression, where the odds seem to be stacked against them. No matter what they do, they don't seem to be able to break out of that poverty. And so looking then at those two settings, what does that do to the reading of the Bible? So as we look at some biblical passages, I'll start with the Exodus narrative, which is absolutely central in liberation theology. And this is read just completely straightforwardly. What is it a story about? It's a story about a people who are a minority. They're oppressed. They are the outcast, the foreigner. They are slaves. And they are in the context of a big, powerful empire who crush them and oppress them and take away their freedom. And then God, through Moses, leads them out of that slavery to freedom in the promised land. And so the idea here is that if you're reading that in the comfort of your study, so the two images here, there's the chap and he's sitting in his college library, he's surrounded by his theology books, he's embedded within a comfortable church context. He's going to read that differently to the image of these people who are living, they're just the desperately poor, they're living in some shanty town underneath a motorway, scratching out a living, just about keeping themselves alive. Now, in that context of reading it as a member of the poor and the oppressed, they're going to read that very, very straightforwardly. They're going to read that and cry out to God to just lead them from this oppressive near slavery into freedom, a promised land where they've got food, where they can feed their children, where they don't fear the police, where they can wash, they've got clean water. It's very, very straightforward reading of it with pretty well no interpretation required whatsoever. Again, with the Old Testament prophets, where you've got the major theme of running through a lot of the Old Testament prophets, you see is the crying out for justice as the wealthy oppress the poor. And again, depending on where you sit as you read that, the poor will read it in a very straightforward way. So looking at a couple of Old Testament prophet quotes, we'll start with Micah. He has told you, that's God. Micah's talking about there. God has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And so you're reading that in the context of being desperately poor at the bottom of society, and you read that and you see that the number one priority is to do justice. And the Christians, the leaders maybe, the clergy working within that context, see that what's their primary responsibility? What is it God requires of them? And what God requires of them, first and foremost, is to bring about justice. And let's now move to Amos, one of the key players then in liberation theology. Old Testament prophets. And note the tone here. Amos, he's not some liberal Democrat politicians, some really nice chap talking on Radio 4. That isn't who Amos is. So here's Amos. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on Mount Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, oh, bring me something to drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness, the time is surely coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. Through breaches in the wall you shall leave, each one straight ahead, and you shall be flung out into Harmon, says the Lord. Now, chances are that's going to land with you differently. If you're there, you're sitting in your theological college library, or you're a clergy and you're sitting in your study at home, and you are part of a sort of middle class structure, and you're comfortably off, you have enough to eat, you're living in a fairly safe context. And that passage is going to land with you completely differently than if you are, back to what we're talking about, where you're living alongside the poor, where you are reading that and you're alongside the squalor of those South American slums, and you are very aware that only a short distance away, you've got millionaires living in gated communities. Now let's move on to the New Testament and our picture of Jesus. And I'll start with that literally. What are the pictures of Jesus which inform our thinking? And so on the slide here, there's the very standard sort of church image of Jesus. He's there, he's a kingly figure on a throne, but very importantly, he's there in a frame, a gold frame, gold pillars next to it. And very often those pictures are in the context of a very ornate and richly decorated church, and that is very much the sort of the church, the traditional, the safe church image of Jesus. And it's incredibly easy to read that in a very safe way. Now, I'm not saying there aren't quite sophisticated theological interpretations of that image which are anything but safe and comfortable. What I am saying is that it's incredibly easy to engage with that in a safe way, and if you want that to be an unsafe image of Jesus, you've got to do a fair amount of work and be fairly theologically literate to do that. That is Jesus sitting on a throne in wealth, and that's not difficult therefore to see where that image would tend to align you as you read the New Testament with that image of Jesus in it. Now, the contrasting image, this is from a graphic novel style presentation of the New Testament, and it's a somewhat different image here. You've got Jesus, the cleansing of the temple, and so he's got his whip made out of cords. He's driving out the cattle and the sheep. He's there turning over the money changers' tables. The doves are flying away. He really is seriously disrupting things, upsetting things. The establishment are definitely unhappy with the way he is functioning. And so which of those images do we have of Jesus as we read the New Testament? One of them, an incredibly safe establishment figure, and then the other, the very opposite of that, the disruptor, the turner over of the tables, the challenger of the religious establishment. And looking at Jesus as he describes his own ministry, and we've got here a passage which is sometimes referred to as the Nazareth Manifesto, as Jesus takes on the words of Isaiah for himself. And as you look at these words, again, this is what we keep returning to. How do these words land? if you are in a South American slum, or if you are in the comfort of your theological college or your comfortable church setting, and you read these, and what's Jesus talking about is he considers his role is going to be to bring good news to the poor. He's going to proclaim release to the captives. He's going to let the oppressed go free. And then he finishes this by saying that today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. And again, if you're living in a South American slum, those bring good news to the poor. What does that mean? It's good news because, you know, I am poor. What do you mean by poor? It means I don't have enough money to feed myself and my children properly. I'm frequently hungry and cold, and I can't afford to buy medicine, and members of my family die. That's what I mean by poor. And Jesus is good news to the poor. You know, what does it mean to proclaim release to the captives? It means to proclaim release to those who are captives. What do you mean by captives? Well, how about those who are in prison? Because the police tend to just go around and round people up and then throw them into prison. Let the oppressed go free. What does that mean? It means, well, it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's about the oppressed. Who are the oppressed? Well, you know, it's those people who can't get anywhere because the rich and the powerful structure society such that there's no way they can ever break out of it because they've got no power. So as you read this in the context of the poor South American slum, it's just incredibly simple to understand what it's about. If you're reading it in the context of your comfortable, wealthy theological college or church, then you've got to try and work out, you're doing your exegesis, what does this actually mean, rather than reading it in the South American slum where you don't need to do any thinking about it at all. It's completely and utterly obvious what it means. And looking then at Jesus' parable of separation at judgment. What does he separate? What does God, the King, what's they separated on the basis of? How is it decided who's going to be sheep and who's going to be goats and which side they're going to go on? Well, it's fairly obvious from this that the righteous are those people who've done what? They've helped God. They've fed God when he was hungry. They've fed God when he was. They've given God drink when he was thirsty. They've clothed God when he was naked. And the righteous are going to say, well, sorry, when did we ever do this? Very powerful piece of theology in that next line. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to the one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. And so you've got a very powerful piece of theology there, which says that for all our equality, for all the fact that we're made in the image of God, and for that we all equally stand as sinners before God, there is something about the poor where God is present with the poor in ways that he is not with the wealthy. And a final passage to look at is the Beatitudes as recorded in Luke. And again, just try and think, just picture yourself in different contexts as to how this is going to land. That's very straightforward. What does Jesus say? He says, blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry now. Blessed are you who weep now. Blessed are you when people hate you. And so you then sitting, oh dear me, what does that mean? Okay, well, you're living in a South American slum. It's pretty obvious what you mean. It's back to where I was before. What do we mean by the poor? It's difficult to work out who the poor are. But then we move on to the bit at the end. Woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full now. Woe to you who are laughing now. Woe to you when all speak well of you. And again, wrestling with that, dear me, what does that mean? Well, probably means exactly what it says. But here's the problem. If you live in a South American slum, that is a passage of great comfort to you, because it shows that, and here's the phrase, this idea, the bias to the poor, that's the way it was expressed in that Church of England Faith in the City report, the preferential option for the poor is another way that is expressed. It's difficult to get away from it in this, both in the New Testament and the Old Testament as you read it. It's difficult to get away from the idea that the poor have a very special place in God's heart. Now that's okay. There's a bit of a snag though, really, if you're there in you're reading these passages in your comfortable middle class church, because it also there's an uncomfortable strand here where God's got a fair amount of criticism for those who are rich. Jesus expresses it here: woe to you who are rich. And of course then you've got this wrestling with, well, what does it mean to be rich? Well, unfortunately it might mean that you're rich if in fact you are comfortably off and you can always feed yourself, clothe yourself, you're always warm, you're always well fed, and you can afford the medical treatment that you need. The snag with passages like this is they are incredibly uncomfortable for the wealthy church, but they bring great comfort to the poor. Let's have a look now at some of the key characters within liberation theology, and by exploring these to get a better feel for it, and also, which is incredibly important, as we look at these four that I've chosen, we can start some evaluation of it as a model. So I'll start with Gustavo Gutierrez, generally considered to be the founding father of liberation theology. And incredibly important to note that he's a member of the establishment, solidly a member of the establishment. I think he's still around, born 1928. Peruvian, these four that I'm looking at are all South American. He's a philosopher, he's a theologian, he's a Dominican priest. And he really completely establishment. He studied medicine and then literature, the National University. Importantly, when he was there, this is San Marcos, he became involved with a group called Catholic Action. Now this is significant because this is laity. We're talking about the Roman Catholic Church here, and laity don't tend to play a really major part. And certainly going back to this point, we're in the sort of 60s and 70s at this point. And these lay Catholics, they were attempting to encourage a Catholic influence on society. So that's at the very least nudging in a political direction. Gutierrez studied, he was at Leuven, Belgium, he studied at Lyon, so he's completely at this stage looking very mainstream, very establishment. And Gutierrez used that establishment position to challenge many aspects of that establishment. His starting point was this idea of preferential option for the poor. That's this idea of, I suppose, bottom-up theology. The praxis is where you start. It's working alongside the poor, reading the Bible alongside the poor, and then looking how you go from praxis and then thinking through your theory after that. So preferential option for the poor. This idea, the Church of England in the 80s used the term bias to the poor, exactly the same thing. And those ideas rooted very much in that idea that you find in the parable from Matthew, when the people are divided into two groups, and the righteous have helped God. How did they help God? Because they'd helped those who were in some way poor. And so this preferential option for the poor, the bias to the poor, is rooted very much in that idea of whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. God speaking there. And this idea that God is in some way especially present with the poor in ways that deduce from that God therefore is not present with the rich in the same way as he is with the poor. And that there is as you read the Bible, there is this preferential option for the poor. God is biased towards the poor. So that it's worth repeating that, because that is the absolute foundational axiom on which liberation theology is built. And what Gutierrez is doing then is he's looking at the connection between salvation, not just having salvation as a rather abstract theological concept that maybe you have a feeling of salvation, but he wants salvation to be very closely linked to a sense of liberation in a real and physical and very practical sort of way, so that liberation of the poor. And what Gutierrez was wrestling with to a large extent was how do you communicate to the poor to say that God loves them? You turn up and you say, yes, God loves you. They certainly don't feel it. There's no existential sense of the love of God for them. They're just downtrodden. Nobody seems to care for them. And there were times when that included the church. And so what Gutierrez is wrestling with here is, if there's a bias to the poor from God, how can the church do the same thing? How can the church show to the poor that they are very special, that they matter, and then looking at working alongside them, so the poor then have the sense that the church are here with us in our poverty, and doing whatever is possible to alleviate that poverty and that suffering of the poor. And that inevitably in this model will lead the church into what is generally termed the political, because again, absolutely axiomatic in liberation theology is that the poverty of those poor people in South America was not to do with sin. It wasn't that they were feckless. It was to do with the structures of society, that it didn't matter how clean living a person was, it doesn't matter how good they were, it doesn't matter how hard they tried, they were simply never going to lift themselves out of poverty, because it was just built into the system where that minority, very affluent elite, tied up with big business, higher echelons of the government, higher echelons of the military and the police, all that just rolled into one as this dominant minority who ruled the country and made sure that the poor stayed where they were and stayed poor. Now, this is incredibly important, as this is worked out in a South American context, when that is then moved into a different context. Now, why the poor are poor is different when that's looked at in a country like United Kingdom, where there is a very extensive benefit system. It's different again in the US, where there is less of a benefit system, it's a different model. And so in each context, a vitally important question to ask is, why are these people poor? And a lot of that is to do with how much is about personal responsibility and how much is about what would generally be termed structural oppression. And alongside that criticism that Gutierrez was levelling at the political structures within society, he also was very critical of the Roman Catholic hierarchy, who a lot of the time Gutierrez saw as being part of that affluent elite who were causing the problems to the poor. Needless to say, that didn't go down too well with that Roman Catholic hierarchy who Gutierrez was criticising. Now, Gutierrez wasn't disputing the fact that there were times when the church did help individual members of the church, that sort of food parcel, food bank model. But the most important thing that Gutierrez was concerned about was to move away from the idea of the church simply helping individuals by providing a food bank, or maybe getting some medical treatment for the individual, but to look at this at the structural level. And then in 1974, he founded the Lima branch of the Bartolomé de las Casas Institute. And the mission statement, it's worth reading this out, the mission statement, it aims to use theology as a means of addressing contemporary social issues and educating through research, engagement with lawmakers and collaboration with grassroots organisation. And so this takes us back again to that absolutely fundamental concept within liberation theology. It's this idea of where are you doing your theology? What is the purpose of your theology? And its concern with the structures of society, not just with the individual and the individual salvation. And so what Gutierrez is encouraging people to do here is to get alongside the poor, to really engage with what the issues are for them, and then to work through the social structures of law and education in order that the causes, the structural causes of poverty can be in some way alleviated. And that is the fundamental element of liberation theology. Okay, next person we're going to look at is Leonardo Boff. Born 1938, so 10 years younger than Gutierrez, and as far as I'm aware, he's still around. Another South American theologian, philosopher, writer, and he is currently Professor Emeritus of Ethics, Philosophy of Religion and Ecology. Now that combination there is quite important. Two of those seem to go together very well. Ethics and Philosophy of Religion, very commonly put together. The English A-level in religious studies, most students will take a paper in ethics and a paper in philosophy of religion. But you've then got this third one of ecology, and that just typifies the liberation theology approach of broadening out from those what might be perceived as fairly narrowly conceived theological areas of study like philosophy of religion and ethics, and saying, well, actually, no, we've got to get out into more what you might call real life with our theology. Now, Boff's starting point, exactly the same as Gutierrez. It's that you start with your praxis and you go to your theory from there. And he's got right at the heart of his thinking this idea of the preferential option for the poor, the bias to the poor. Well, where I want to go with Boff and the aspect of liberation theology I want to explore using him is this idea of what is the church? How do you recognise the church? How does it manifest itself on earth? And Boff is often associated with the idea of base ecclesial communities. They could also be seen as house churches, people simply meeting together in each other's houses. So this goes back again to this idea of you start with praxis. The Christians go into these poor areas, they facilitate church, and facilitate church in that context means they gather people together around the Bible to read the Bible together and to pray together. And very importantly, they're doing this in each other's houses. And so that leads us on to some fairly important questions which need to be explored. So what is the church? How do we understand the church? And I'm working with two images here of this gathering here, which I'm assuming is the Vatican, to symbolise the Roman Catholic Church, or capitals, and contrasting it with the local Christians meeting together and meeting together in each other's homes. So to use that liberation theology term, the base ecclesial community. Okay, so let's start with this one. We've got here this gathering, these, I'm assuming, cardinals, this is, I'm assuming, the Vatican, but it's just a great symbol of that top echelon of the Roman Catholic Church. And at the moment I'm focusing on the Roman Catholic Church. Liberation theology is very much from that context, and its issues are highlighted most strongly within that structure. And so we'll look at it in terms of the Roman Catholic Church, and then it can be taken from there out into other denominations, but the differences aren't quite so stark. So this is a good place to work, because it's so obvious what's being highlighted. And so here they are. We've got this this wonderfully symbolises the establishment. All these people here are, however they may have started off, they're certainly now all very comfortably off, very well fed. You can imagine the refreshments through the day. Whatever this event is, the refreshment will be very good, the food will be very good, hospitality will be very good. They're all very comfortably off, and in their own way fairly powerful men who are unquestionably solidly part of the establishment. And you look at the context in which they're meeting, this absolutely priceless art in this absolutely vast, beautiful building. And so really what we're looking at is, okay, so through the day at some point they're going to study the Bible. And going right back to where we started at the beginning of this, how's the Bible going to land with these people? As these people, maybe the passage for the study for this is going to be, maybe they're going to look at the Exodus. How does the Exodus narrative land with these people? Maybe the Beatitudes. How do the Beatitudes land with these people? And so this is the symbol. This is the powerful. These are the people who can mix quite comfortably with the rich and the powerful in the world. These are the people who have direct access to the senior politicians in their countries. These are the top layer of the Roman Catholic Church, and how does the Bible speak to them? Okay, let's go now to what we could see as the other end of the scale and look at the base ecclesial community. It couldn't be further from that Vatican hierarchy than this. And so here again, I'll talk about this in the South American context, and what you've got here then is just a group of people, and they meet in each other's homes. They meet for Bible study. They meet for prayer. They can sing hymns. You can see the chap there with the guitar. Now, what's incredibly important about this is that for many sections of the church, this is just absolutely bread and butter stuff. It's a profound challenge to the Roman Catholic way of doing things. So my own personal background, I'm an Anglican priest now, but I started life in the Methodist Church, and Methodism is just rooted in this model. The Wesley brothers in the late 18th and then early 19th century, as Methodism broke away from the Church of England, it was based on this model. You had what were called classes. You've got this group of people, about a dozen of them maybe, and you have a class leader who is a laity, and they were in charge of looking after the class, and they would read the Bible together, they'd pray together, and then they would gather together on a Sunday for the whole church worship. But the rooting of it was in these small groups, and it was completely lay-led, and that's the way that the Methodist Church and other Protestant churches work. I mean, my own personal journey, I started training as a Methodist local preacher when I was sort of 18, 19-ish. I hate to think what the quality of the services were like in those days, but anyway, that's the way it worked. I was fully qualified as a Methodist local preacher by the time I was 21. I was just let loose out and running services in churches. And that is completely that base ecclesial community model. You just take whatever leadership is there, however young and however inexperienced, and you sit around, you gather around the Bible and prayer and worship of whatever sort, all lay-led, absolutely bread and butter within the Protestant church. We need to keep coming back to this, most definitely not bread and butter within the Roman Catholic Church. And one of the things that's profoundly, importantly missing from this, of course, is the priest. There is no priest there to tell them what they're supposed to believe. There's no priest to tell them what to do. And absolutely crucial, there is no priest to administer the sacraments. And so these base ecclesial communities would be seen as just in danger of becoming Protestant. In those Methodist churches and others similar, the home group as the basic unit, no sacraments doesn't matter because the Eucharist is just not central. Methodists will often go for months without taking communion, and even at its most regular they might only be taking communion once a month. Just not important. And the same would be in other church, Baptist churches, independent churches. The taking communion is fairly peripheral. And of course, these base ecclesial communities, they're living in a context where there are Protestant churches. The Pentecostal churches in South America are vigorous and numerically very strong and growing. And of course, as the Roman Catholic hierarchy are looking at this, one of the things they're seeing is they're losing their grip, they're losing control, their power over the people is diminishing. And so as these people here are following up on Gutierrez ideas and Boff and this preferential option for the poor, this theology from below, it starts with praxis. It starts just with the local Christians gathered together around the Bible, probably with some sort of facilitator. As in Methodism, you had the class leader. The class leader was somebody who he'd got enough education, he'd got enough knowledge to be able to lead and encourage, and those others gathered around. And one of the things that this does, and you see this in the poor areas of UK, you see it in Old Methodism, you see it in these base ecclesial communities. This is a way for developing leadership within these poor communities. And so looking at Methodism, Methodists were very influential in the early trade union and labour movements because they were the people in the community who were educated, not formally educated. These people probably hadn't even meaningful much. They certainly hadn't gone to university. But it was gathering around the Bible and reading. They were discussing, so they were becoming articulate. They may have been illiterate when they started, but they would learn to read and write through the church. They were working with ideas. They were developing their confidence. They were maybe preaching, in which case they were people developing the confidence to stand up in front of 20 people, maybe 200 people, and speak confidently to that number of people. And so what these base ecclesial communities are doing is exactly the same as you found historically in UK, and you still find in the poor areas of UK today. The church at this base level, the home group level, is developing lay leadership skills, developing people who are embedded within the community, who are able then to change the community from within. They've got the confidence to engage in conversations with local politicians, with whoever it might be, that need to be engaged for change to happen. And so really what you've got with these base ecclesial communities is a very standard model that's been used throughout church history. In many ways, you can go right back to the early church that we read about in Acts, and this is the model that they're using. It is, of course, particularly significant when this model starts to develop within the Roman Catholic Church, because it is, in many ways, it's just anathema to that whole Roman Catholic model, which is very authoritarian. It starts at the top with the Pope, it comes down through the Vatican, comes down to the local level with the priest. The priest is the one who can administer the sacraments, and it's all located around him. The base ecclesial community model threatens that. I want to move on now to look at two other characters who can be included in this liberation theology exploration. Now, the two started with Gutierrez and Boff are absolutely mainstream liberation theology. They sort of almost define what it's about. And these two I want to look at now, Camilo Torres and Oscar Romero. These are people who would sit on the wings of liberation theology, and these two are on opposite ends of the spectrum of liberation theology. But they're very useful to look at these two in terms of understanding the Roman Catholic reaction to liberation theology. Okay, let's start then with Camilo Torres. Now, he is not a very well-known character at all. I studied him because I was very drawn to that Christian Marxist position, which was a pretty cool position to hold in the 60s and 70s, and quite drawn to his approach. And he's somebody who's worth looking at because he, in some ways, can be seen as showing where logically you would go as following that liberation theology model. Or, of course, you've got the question as to, has he overstepped a mark and ceased to be part of that liberation theology model because he has stepped outside of what is acceptable to still then retain the label of Christian. Now, Camilo Torres, in many ways, you can see he predates those other two in terms of liberation theology, as he died in 1966. But he was using exactly the same model that was then developed into liberation theology. He was embedded with the poor. He identified with the poor. He was doing his theology from the bottom. And one of the things that he did, which marks him out, which is why we're looking at him, is that as he saw the problems of the poor, and he identified in exactly the same way that Gutierrez and Boff and the others did, that the poverty was not to do with the individual responsibility of the poor, it was structural, that the entire structures of society were oppressive. They meant that people, the vast majority of the population, were just locked into a poverty from which they could never escape. And as Camilo Torres, as he read his Bible, as he studied it, and he would have been looking at those standard passages of the Exodus and Amos, those calls that God is on the side of the poor, that where Camilo Torres ended up was he decided that the only way of changing those structures in society, it wasn't going to be conversation, it wasn't going to be through politics of the ballot box. The only way of doing it was by armed revolution. And so Camilo Torres threw his lot in with the liberation movement in Colombia. It's a Roman Catholic priest in Colombia, and he threw his lot in with the Marxist, the communist revolutionaries. And that was then that was how he was going to work out his bias to the poor, how he was going to work out his preferential option for the poor. God is on the side of the poor are oppressed. The only way of changing the oppression is by a military overthrow. And so he committed himself to that armed struggle. And I mean, he was clearly very serious about this. I mean, he was killed in combat when his unit then came in contact and a firefight with a Colombian military patrol, and Camilo Torres was killed in that action. Now, one of the things I want to look at in some detail is a quote from Camilo Torres, which was really at the heart of the way that he lived out his priesthood and his Christian faith in that sort of liberation theology model. And he said, if Jesus was alive today, he would have been a guerrillero In other words, as far as Camilo Torres was concerned, he was living out exactly how Jesus would have lived if he had been in Colombia at the time. That if Jesus had been in Colombia and Jesus saw the oppression of the poor at that time, Jesus too would have been a guerrilla fighter. He would have taken up arms and joined the Marxist revolutionaries and gone into battle against the oppressive political forces. There is actually a fairly major snag with Camilo Torres' approach there, which we need to look at in a bit more detail. Now, the main flaw with the argument from Camilo Torres is that there's not an if bit there. If Jesus was alive today, he'd have been a guerrillero. Well, actually, being a guerrillero was a live option for Jesus at the time, and he did not take it. There were no shortage of guerrilleros, freedom fighters, the zealots, no shortage of those around at Jesus' time, and particularly in Galilee. That was a hotbed of revolutionary ideas challenging the Romans. These were as far as the Romans were concerned, these zealots were just terrorists. Plenty of the wealthy Jewish establishment who also considered them to be terrorists as well. Jesus could have taken that guerrillero option. Could have been a freedom fighter, could have been a zealot. In fact, he could have been more than just a zealot. He could have been a zealot leader, an account of the people wanted to make him, make Jesus their king. And so this was a live option. Now, the indications are, in fact, it went the other way around. One of Jesus' disciples was obviously an ex-zealot. We know that because he was known as Simon the Zealot. Bit of a giveaway there. And so, in fact, what you've got is the exact opposite of Jesus would have been a guerrillero, in that Jesus presented an alternative option, which some of the guerrilleros, the zealots, chose to take and actually followed Jesus instead of taking that revolutionary violence option. Now, the next person I want to look at then, Oscar Romero. Now, whether he's normally considered to be liberation theology or not, I want to look at him because I see him to a certain extent sort of limiting case. He's on the opposite wing to Camilo Torres. Oscar Romero, Roman Catholic priest, archbishop is where he ended up. He also ended up being killed by the government. Camilo Torres was killed by the government as a guerrilla, Marxist guerrilla fighting against the government. Oscar Romero was killed by the government. Well, not officially. It's generally assumed he was killed by the government. Well, I'm fairly confident the government has never admitted that they executed him. But Oscar Romero was somebody who stood against the government. He stood against the government from his position in the Roman Catholic hierarchy. So Oscar Romero remained solidly part of the Roman Catholic establishment, but also was somebody willing to challenge the power structures that he saw were damaging the poor. Now, why Oscar Romero is so important is because here is somebody who was the Archbishop of El Salvador, and so he was clearly part of the establishment. He's not only part of the Roman Catholic Church's hierarchy and establishment as an archbishop, but because of that position, he was also somebody who was in contact on a fairly regular basis with the senior military political figures. El Salvador is a pretty nasty place at that stage. This sort of fascist military regime in place, very brutal, would stop at nothing to eliminate any opponents to the regime. And Oscar Romero, as Archbishop, was somebody who was moving in those circles, the wealthy elite who lived in their gated communities, and the captains of industry, all that layer of society. Oscar Romero had access to them. Those are the circles he moved in because he was a senior figure in the establishment. But why Oscar Romero is so significant is that he didn't just simply blend in with that lot and be the church for that lot. what he did is he took the line of he was reading his Bible very genuinely, and he could see that a lot of what they were doing was radically opposed to the church's teaching, and he took the risk and he spoke out against that. He took this courageous position. He wasn't just going to be an establishment man who did what the government told him and just sort of blessed everything the government did. Now, because he stood against the government, if you stood against the El Salvadorian government at the time, you didn't last long. And exactly that happened to Oscar Romero, archbishop or local parish priest. The regime couldn't care less. If you were challenging them, then you were killed. And that's what happened then to Oscar Romero. But very importantly, Oscar Romero's position and his model of working was recognized within the hierarchy, and so he was canonized by Pope Francis in 2018. Let's move now to the Roman Catholic response, the official church response to liberation theology. Now, this is well presented. There's a document called Roman Catholic Church Responses to South American Liberation Theology, and I'll put the link in the notes below. And it's an excellent read, very nuanced, very carefully argued. It's one of those standard pieces of very carefully argued Roman Catholic theology, those documents that the Vatican produces. It's pretty heavyweight stuff, it's not light reading. You have to, really wade through it and do some very careful thinking as you go through. But as we look at this, one of the things that we see in this nuanced response is shown really in that rejection of Camilo Torres, who is now essentially forgotten, and their response to Oscar Romero. So getting this Vatican response requires quite a lot of work. It's holding different ideas in tension. It's a very carefully argued and reasoned theological document. But one of the foundational elements to it is the one that I think is profoundly relevant today as we see the church engaged in a number of issues, and that's the opposition of the church to the Marxist analysis, which seems to underlie so much liberation theology. And so it's a question really of saying, well, okay, that sounds like a good idea to do your go from a practice. You embed yourself in the context of the poor, because that means you're going to read the Bible differently. The passages are going to land differently. The Exodus narrative will land differently if you're living and working alongside the poor in a South American slum than if you are in the comfort of the Vatican. Now, that is correct, but you can also say, well, it's also correct that if you spend your time soaked in a Marxist analysis, you're reading Marx, you're talking with people who are Marxists, your entire worldview is being shaped by Marx, then as you read the Bible, you're going to find that the Bible is going to, it's suddenly miraculously turned into this Marxist text. And so this idea of being aware of the Marxist analysis, the Marxist approach, and aligning yourself too closely with the Marxism was an incredibly important insight of that Vatican critique. And we see this in many of the movements today. Some of the standard ones would be Black Lives Matter and the Extinction Rebellion. And it's a question of, are the Christians involved in those? Are they rooted within the context and reading the Bible within the context, or are they just completely embedded in the movement and then reading the Bible through the filter through the lenses, seeing the Bible through the lens that movement gives them to view the world. So are they viewing the world? So Camilo Torres, fairly obviously, when he read his Bible, he was viewing it through a Marxist lens. People involved in, Christians involved in Black Lives Matter, who just seem to be joining in with everything. Are they just simply viewing the Bible through a Black Lives Matter lens, through a Black Lives Matter filter, and likewise with Extinction Rebellion? So that idea of coming out of that Vatican analysis, which says that we really do have to make sure we are rooted within the Bible, its biblical theology and its church tradition. And they did note that there's plenty that has been brought to the fore by liberation theology, which had been lost, and it's very important, that care for the poor, the concern for the poor, which has always been in the Bible. You can very clearly see it, that idea of a preferential option for the poor, a bias to the poor. Now, that's not invented, that's not a Marxist analysis, that's clearly present within the Bible when you read it. And so it's that the liberation theology, possibly it's the Marxist analysis which has helped them to see it, but it's the recognising that the church had in fact as many times tended to just read the Bible through the lens of the power establishment of the time, that's wrong, but it's also wrong to then just read the Bible through a Marxist analysis. So and a lot of this, it's about nuance, it's about balance. That's not about coming up with just some sort of bland middle path. It's about making sure that any radical teaching, any radical approach that is there is genuinely coming out of the Bible. And there's plenty within the Bible that's pretty radical. Jesus is about as radical as you can get. But the radical teaching needs to be coming from Jesus and from the Bible, not from Marx. And linked to that as well is the tendency within liberation theology to politicize passages and to lose the spiritual. Now, one of the things that's very important is, as we read the Bible, then this distinction that we make today, quite commonly made today, between the political and the spiritual, those are divisions which certainly make no sense at all to those Jews in the Old Testament. And it might even be post-Reformation before you really see that distinction between the political and the theological and the spiritual coming into play. Before that, it was very much a question of you've just got life, and some aspects of life are to do with government, some aspects of life are to do with taking the sacraments, but they're not clearly divided into those two realms. And so one of the things that that Roman Catholic critique of liberation theology wanted to ensure was that it was a both and, that you can't just simply approach the issues of the poor in terms of a political analysis, looking at the Exodus narrative purely in political terms, that you change the political structures and that will be the answer. Well, actually, no, it won't. That's just as much of a problem as the one that was being challenged, which saw the church hierarchy just want to give the sacraments to the poor and give them promise of, it'll be okay when you go to heaven after you die. That it's the pure liberation politically will still leave those people with that spiritual hunger. It will still leave those people bound in that sort of spiritual realm, that you have to have a both and. You need a holistic analysis of the problems of the poor. That yes, there are clearly structural issues which need to be dealt with at the political level, and there are also, and these are entirely indistinguishable, you can't, they're inextricably linked, that you also need to make sure that as you engage with issues, whatever it is, that you are coming from a biblical perspective, that you are looking at God's perspective, that you are engaging in prayer, expecting the Holy Spirit to guide, to intervene, that God is expected to be present, and that the church should be leading, not following. And so the church should be giving the guidance. It's not a question looking in contemporary terms of the church just joining on, leaping on the bandwagon of Black Lives Matter, jumping on the bandwagon of Extinction Rebellion. But the church having a genuine, authentic, biblical critique to see where the church should be going. Now, the other aspect of the critique of the church of the liberation theology was this issue of raised by the base ecclesial communities. Now, that's very much a Roman Catholic issue. The issues of the spiritual and the political, and taking the Marxist agenda and just jumping onto local movements, that's an entire church issue. Just how much laity should have the ability to do their own theology, just how much there is a necessity for the people, the churches, to be embedded within the Roman Catholic hierarchy and structures. That is very particularly a Roman Catholic issue. However, one of the things that is fairly obvious, and that is that if you've got local congregations who aren't rooted in a tradition and aren't accountable, they can very easily wander off down some very destructive and very weird and wacky theological understandings, which are not helpful to anybody. And so all the time with this, it's this balance, this nuanced position of having a theology which is thoroughly rooted within the Bible, within prayer, within an expectation that God is going to be involved. And so that impinges on this, ensuring you don't use a Marxist analysis, you use a biblical analysis, that making sure that any local congregation is rooted firmly within the wider body of Christ and is rooted in the Bible, and biblical interpretation is tested against church history and against the others who are working with the Bible, to ensure that each local congregation is remaining within that one holy Catholic and apostolic church, in order that God's word can be spoken prophetically to people anywhere about any issue. And that liberation that we see in the Exodus narrative, that is going to be a genuine liberation, and is not going to just be a hollow political solution to some external issues, but leave the individual and the communities therefore fundamentally unchanged.